Volume 90, number 340. Their murder stole in. Look at that, they used a period at the end of the sentence. They don't do that anymore. A rich man and his wife killed stealthily at home. Period. Millionaire Andrew J. Borden of Fall River had just returned back from the bank and was lying on a lounge in his sitting room when an assassin slipped in and struck him with an axe or cleaver. Mrs. Borden was upstairs and was murdered by the same instrument. The bodies discovered by a daughter who had been out of the house only a few minutes. The servant upstairs heard no noise. All avenues of escape covered, but no trace of the murderer secured. Fall River, August 4th. Andrew J. Borden, the millionaire mill owner, and his aged wife were murdered in their home today just before noon. And although there were other members of the family on the premises at the time, they heard no sound. And the murderer escaped without leaving a clue, so far as is known, although his clothing must have been covered with the blood of his victims. The boldness of the crime and the utter absence of any apparent motive make it the more mysterious. At 11 o'clock, Mr. Borden was lying on the lounge in his sitting room, reading a newspaper. He was seen by his daughter Lizzie as she passed through the room on her way to the barn to get a piece of iron with which to mend a flower pot. The servant, Bridget Sullivan, passed through the room at the same time with a pail of water in her hand. She was on her way to the second floor to clean the windows. Mrs. Borden was in her room over the parlor, changing her dress, preparatory to making a visit to sick neighbors. 15 minutes later, Miss Borden re-entered the house, and when she stepped through the doorway into the sitting room, she saw her father's body horribly mutilated and lying in a pool of blood by the side of the lounge. She was overwhelmed at the sight. Then she screamed for help. Bridget Sullivan was washing a window in a rear room, but she lost no time in running to Miss Borden's aid. Mrs. Churchill, a neighbor, also heard the scream, and she hastened to the house. She entered the house by the front way, and the servant commanded all approaches to the house from the rear, but neither saw anyone leaving the house. Miss Borden then called for her mother, but received no response. She ran upstairs to her mother's room and fainted when she opened the door. Her mother had been murdered in the same brutal manner, her skull being crushed in by some heavy instrument, apparently an axe. Mr. Borden had been brained by the back of the axe, and in addition had been hacked with the sharp edge until his head was chopped to pieces. Both rooms in which the murderers had been committed were besplattered with blood, but showed no signs of a struggle. No attempt at robbery had been made. Who the murderer was, why he committed the crime, or where he went to, are the questions which the police would like to solve. But thus far they have found nothing that can help them. They have arrested 3 persons on suspicion, but the only suspicious circumstance about them was the fact that they were seen in the neighborhood about the hour of the murder. Mr. Borden was a very large owner of real estate in Fall River. Mr. Charles C. Cook was his agent collecting his rents, and yesterday paid to the old gentleman a large sum of money from his rentals. He had made regular deposits in the Union Bank and never paid any accounts except by check. He left his home as usual about 9 o'clock this morning to take his deposit to the bank, and called at the Union Savings Bank at the same time. Called in this case means he went there. He was shaved at his barber's, Pierre Ledoux, at 9:33 o'clock. At about 10:30, his deposit was received at the Union Bank, and he went from there to his home, arriving about 20 minutes of 11 o'clock, and going into the sitting room to recline upon the lounge and read the newspaper. Mr. John N. Morse, his brother-in-law, went out about the same time Mr. Borden did, and Mrs. Borden said, as he passed out, "Good morning. We shall expect you back to dinner." Mrs. Borden went upstairs to make the bed in which Mr. Morse slept in the bedroom in the front of the house. The house faces the west. On the north side is the arbor, and in the south is an entry with stairs leading to the chamber in the second story. Back of the parlor is the sitting room where Mr. Borden was reading. The lounge upon which he lay was against the partition separating the dining room from the kitchen. A back entry leads from the kitchen to the yard. In this back entry are the back stairs. The pantry is directly under the back stairs and the door leading to the cellar. It is now the presumption that the assassin was concealed in this cellarway directly under the back staircase when Miss Borden passed out to go to the barn. It is the theory of the police, and it seems well substantiated by all the evidence, that as soon as the murderer found the coast clear, he stole through the kitchen, Bridget Sullivan being upstairs, and passed into the sitting room, where he found Mr. Borden. In the opinion of the medical examiner Dolan, Mr. Borden was killed with one blow. There was a horrible gash, cleaving the skull and penetrating to the brain. This cut passed directly across the right eye. There were 1 or 2 detached cuts higher on the head, but believed to be made by the same blow. It would seem apparent, however, that for some cause or other, Mrs. Borden's attention was aroused, and probably she started to come down the front of the stairs from the parlor chamber. The assassin, hearing her movements and knowing that he must have no witnesses, rushed upstairs with the instinct of self-preservation. She probably ran back to the chamber she had just left, where 2 windows opened directly upon the street. She passed through the entry door, round a bed that stood out in the middle of the floor, and was struck down between the bed and the bureau. Her skull was split open with one blow, just as her husband's had been. There was no sound that anybody heard until Miss Borden's cry came ringing up the back stairs to the servant girl in the attic. Mrs. Churchill, who responded to the daughter's scream, lives not more than 20 feet from the sitting room window. The murder could have been seen from her sitting room. As soon as the police were notified of the murder, Marshal Hillard placed a cordon of police around the house and allowed nobody to enter, although hundreds crowded around the premises. The officers made a vain search for traces of the murderer. Whoever he was, he departed as stealthily as he came. Search was also made for the weapon. No less than 2 axes and 2 hatchets were found in different places, but not one of them bore a trace of blood. The peculiarity of the cuts seemed to indicate that the weapon was a cleaver, but no such article was to be found. The remark of the servant girl, "It must have been the Portuguese," gave rise to a story which Marshal Hillard says he has proved to be an idle tale, which was that a Portuguese who had been at work on Mr. Borden's farm in Swanson across the river had been discharged, and he had come back to the house demanding his pay, and had murdered Mr. and Mrs. Borden. Marshal Hillard says that there was not any Portuguese that can be found who worked for Mr. Borden, or who had recently been discharged. Well, that's interesting. In all the tales I've read about this, I never heard of the servant or the lie that was told. Maybe I should call that an unsubstantiated claim. Here we have someone at the premises who tries to pin this on someone who doesn't exist and was never found. Some of the neighbors saw a man whom they took for a Portuguese walking up and down in front of Mr. Borden's house. Now, how would they know he was from Portugal and not Spain? If there were a lot of Portuguese immigrants in that area, it's not in this article. A researcher would have to look into that, because this is an unsolved murder. Some of the neighbors saw a man whom they took for a Portuguese walking up and down in front of Mr. Borden's house, but the man they describe as a Portuguese is a Swede. Now, how could the neighbors mistake someone from Sweden who is light-skinned, light-haired, and someone from Portugal who probably lives in a sunny, warmer climate, much warmer than Sweden? So anyway, the Swede, who has worked for years on Mr. Borden's farm in Swansea, I think I mispronounced that word before. It looks like Swansea here. And who was his foreman? Now, that's a trusted individual, that Swede, if that word is Swede. He's a foreman. He was his foreman then and highly trusted by all the family. He proved satisfactorily to the police that he was not and could not have been in Fall River, and that he had not been out of his house. He had no quarrel with Mr. Borden, who thought very highly of him. The first man arrested was John Joseph Mayer. He was found by an officer in the outskirts under a car on the New Boston Road. He was considered under the influence of liquor and was locked up. I don't think it was him. He's just a drunk. It was found that all he knew of the case was what someone had told him. Mayer was locked up upon general principles and held for drunkenness. Two suspicious peddlers of jewelry, which they were ready to exchange for old clothing, were overhauled on Bay Street. They were overhauled. We don't use that expression anymore. They were a sidebar top buggy and were arrested on suspicion. They told two different stories, saying at one time that they had come from Brockton direct, and at another time they stopped in Taunton last night and came to Fall River this morning. They were arrested about 1:30 o'clock, and the pair were located in the vicinity of 2nd Street this forenoon as early as 10:40 o'clock by the police. These are all the police have under arrest. It is said that Mr. Borden had a store for 2 months in the Borden block, and that an out-of-town stranger called upon him 2 weeks ago and wanted to rent it. And Mr. Borden said, "No, I'll not let it," for what is presumably a liquor store, and that there were words in consequence. Mr. Borden was heard to say to the man, "Call and see me next time you come to town." The man went off. Since then, the store has been let to a Fall River tradesman. Mrs. Borden was present at the interview of this out-of-town stranger, and the theory is that if he killed Mr. Borden, he must have remembered that Mrs. Borden would recall him and would be dangerous in a trial. The police are watching the brother-in-law, Mr. Morse. It's strange that if robbery was the motive, nothing was taken. Andrew J. Borden was a member of the famous Old Fall River family. He was a son of Abraham Borden, and several years ago was the head of the old firm of Borden and Almy in the furniture business, investing his money later in real estate. He was the president of the Union Savings Bank, a director of the BMC Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company, and identified with the Central Congregational Church. He was about 65 years old and his wife about 60. That's the end of the article, and I'm a little bit surprised that he was the president of the bank where he made his deposits. And as the president, if he caught someone embezzling, perhaps, he might have had a problem with this person. The servant attempts to blame a Portuguese man, and nobody knows anything about him. And she claims that he was discharged, and nobody knows anything about that. That's odd. Lizzie Borden probably did not kill her parents. She was acquitted, and she suffered tremendously. Whoever killed Mr. and Mrs. Borden had to have motive, opportunity, and know how to get rid of a murder weapon. The servant didn't have time to dispose of a murder weapon and change clothes because blood was splattered all over. You don't hit someone in the head, break their skull open without a very strong force which will splatter blood everywhere. And so whoever killed Mr. Borden had to change clothes and clean up the mess. And there's no evidence of that. So that's my analysis. There are many more articles about this story. You can imagine when there's a double murder like this and it's unsolved, everybody wants to figure it out. And eventually they charged Lizzie Borden with the crime, and then eventually she was acquitted. But when I searched for Lizzie Borden and found this Library of Congress, I found the Library of Congress write-up. And at the bottom of the page they had all of these articles tracing the entire history, multiple newspaper sources, the trial, the acquittal. There were probably 10 or 11 links there. And I clicked on one and went to the New York Sun. But there's a lot more that can be done with this story if you're interested. It's a very famous double murder. And now, more than 110 years later, we still don't know who did it. If you know anything about this crime, please call 555-1212 and tell us what you know. And we'll dig up the guy that you suspect and interrogate him, slap him around, torture him, and see if we can get anything out of him. Maybe we'll get a confession. Thanks for listening. Volume 90, number 340. Their murder stole in. Look at that. They used a period at the end of the sentence. They don't do that anymore. A rich man and his wife killed stealthily at home. Period. Millionaire Andrew J. Borden of Fall River had just returned back from the bank and was lying on a lounge in his sitting room when an assassin slipped in and struck him with an axe or cleaver. Mrs. Borden was upstairs and was murdered by the same instrument. The bodies discovered by a daughter who had been out of the house only a few minutes. The servant upstairs heard no noise. All avenues of escape covered, but no trace of the murderer secured. Fall River, August 4th. Andrew J. Borden, the millionaire mill owner, and his aged wife were murdered in their home today just before noon. And although there were other members of the family on the premises at the time, they heard no sound. And the murderer escaped without leaving a clue, so far as is known, although his clothing must have been covered with the blood of his victims. The boldness of the crime and the utter absence of any apparent motive make it the more mysterious. At 11 o'clock, Mr. Borden was lying on the lounge in his sitting room, reading a newspaper. He was seen re-entered the house, and when she stepped through the doorway into the sitting room, she saw her father's body horribly mutilated and lying in a pool of blood by the side of the lounge. She was overwhelmed at the sight. Then she screamed for help. Bridget Sullivan was washing a window in a rear room, but she lost no time in running to Miss Borden's aid. Mrs. Churchill, a neighbor, also heard the scream, and she hastened, seen by his daughter Lizzie, as she passed through the room on her way to the barn to get a piece of iron with which to mend a flower pot. The servant, Bridget Sullivan, passed through the room at the same time with a pail of water in her hand. She was on her way to the second floor to clean the windows. Mrs. Borden was in her room over the parlor, changing her dress, preparatory to making a visit to sick neighbors. 15 minutes later, Miss Borden